Yo, so this is Scotty here. I'm gonna doing a little thing called Ittocs Taco Time Talks, and basically what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna interview myself. So let's get started. So let's introduce our guest, Ittocs. Hey, I'm Ittocs. I'm just you. Yeah. So what's the first thing today? Well, first thing I wanted to talk about is just basic human things. You know, like for instance, differences in languages. Not just differences in different languages, but different languages within the same language. To do this, I'm going to refer to something that a lot of people probably know about. It's called gamer language. What do you think about gamer language, Talks? Gamer language is a very interesting thing because it's dependent upon certain games. Not just certain games, certain genres of games. So, for instance, you have your FPSs. You have standard language when it comes to FPSs, you know? And you look at RTSs. You got a specific language when it comes to RTSs. Some of the languages are crossover, natural, because it's gamer language, right? But each game essentially has an interlocked, interdeveloped language. Let's see. You'll have your drones for Zerg, and you'll have your SCVs for your Terran, and you'll have your probes for Protoss. And the general term for all of these is workers, because that's what they do. That's their job. They're workers. Despite being three different things, right? They're still workers. And that is kind of the idea of language within language within language, which is kind of the idea we're going to be talking about today. Well, that's a great way of putting it. I'm also a very heavy StarCraft fan, but let's take it to a different genre of game, like a basic MMO, let's say, RuneScape. Oh, it's a good one. Yeah, I agree. RuneScape's pretty great. So with RuneScape, you've got the same kind of idea of the language, but more on a mass scale, because you're actually interacting with multiple people as opposed to, just one person, or if you're 2v2 or 3v3, whatever, but generally it's a lot more than 10 people at a time, if you know what I mean. So from there, you get your individual economic languages. For instance, selling and buying things. GP, gold pieces. Great basic example. No one's gonna go around typing gold pieces. Just say GP. Yeah, I could agree with that. And there's a lot of things, classes, it's just, there's so much. And if you're a gamer, you completely understand. Now, trying to explain that to someone who's not a gamer, let's flip the coin here and go over something that I'm not very familiar with. That'd be like sports. I'm familiar with sports on a esports level, but not necessarily a actual sports. I'm trying to get into UFC right now, but I don't know if I'm a sports like that kind of person. But so, for instance, if you're a gamer and you go to an NFL game, you're not going to know any of the language. Hockey game, you're not going to know any of the language. It's just language within language within language, because everything specific needs titles. And every word can be used for different things. Like, for instance, bot in an RTS is basically an AI that you would fight against, so you wouldn't have to fight other players. It's like a trading bot. And you go to an MMO, and you mention the word bot. And now we're talking about somebody who sets up something automatically that spams certain things, go to their websites, scam people out of certain things, and just in general fuck up the entire idea of communication because they just stand there and just doubling GP, $2 million minimum. and then they just steal all your money, and they just sit there and go, oh, go to this site and look at my YouTube and comment, and I'll give you money. And it's like that kind of stuff. That's a bot in MMO terms. Or you could have like real life terms for a bot, which would basically be like an automated system. You know, you're trying to call ICBC, and you go through the number system, press all the numbers before you frickin' get to the kind of place that you're at. Even businesses have their own specific kind of languages. And again, there's the universal overall language, and then there's, as you get more detailed and more in depth into things, you get more and more refined. I'd say, yeah, refined language, which is you can use a lot less to show a lot more. Like, for instance, in play like League of Legends or something like that, class system. Basically, if you're designated a certain class, you know what vocabulary falls under your class. And vocabulary also falls under task, because the vocabulary used is basically only used as verbs for action. You know, like a ping to help Kank Elaine, or a, you know, if you're a jungler, if you're the support, you know, you're going to be healing, or you're going to be buffing someone, even like an MMO or something like that. You're the support guy. There's a certain set of things that go along with that. So, what do you think it talks about trying to use the overall language of that we've established, this is English, to try and break apart those smaller individual refinements in order to create a bridge between certain groups of people that don't necessarily well, let's just say there's a language barrier between them, and it's not like they don't speak English. So you don't speak gamer if you're a sports guy. You don't speak sports if you're a gamer guy. It's like a metal factory worker doesn't speak miner, you know what I mean? It's just kind of one of those things. And I think we have to recognize that there's this call to refinement in our language, and it basically shows that our, you know, language is not complete, it's not fully developed, but most people would consider that the English language is pretty secure, and let's say in our day and age, any words added to the English language are usually taking two concepts and combining them together to create a new word on that concept, basically portray more of an idea than the original thought. Big ones like science. Well, you know, you've got neuroscience, you've got social science, you've got economic science. It's all science in the fact that it's a process, a reproducible, not necessarily refined, reproducible process that, using, of course, the science of it, refinement. And that's what it comes down to. But I think there's a lack of acceptance on the fact of adding new concepts to the English language with words that aren't just basic words with pronouns, like neuroscience and, you know, that kind of thing. More of a interlocking to make a new word for that category, because you're just taking a category and subsidizing it down to smaller categories, but then you have to take those categories and subsidize them down more. Well, you take the individual parts of neuroscience. Well, if you're looking at, well, brain activity in certain areas of the brain, you're looking at what parts of the brain do what and how it's structured, different, you know, your different hemispheres and the different overall functions of your brain. But specific neuroscience, you could be in an area where you specifically study the frontal left lobe, and that's your specialty, and that's pretty much what you do. But then you're in under category of, let's say, neuroscience. But instead of taking, I don't know what that would be, for instance, but you know, some, again, another just completely randomly made up word. But the problem is the fact of in our reality in English language, we just kind of break down the most scientific understanding we have in basic word of something and crunch it all together. Just, I mean, it's kind of the same idea as like the interrelated video game concept of like abbreviations of things to create other things, like for instance, in RuneScape, if you're raiding and it's like, oh, I'm running the head for Olm or something like that, and it's like a different setup and a different way of playing through that, and you're associated to that based on certain language. It's basically certain things people say, so you associate movement and action towards those in order to complete your task, because you're running the head, which means you basically just run back and forth. And when someone says skip, you just run to the arm and just run backwards and run back to where you're going. Just keep going back and forth. But it's like using already coined terms in order to express a different meaning instead of coming up with completely almost inept words. Because if you're not, that's where it comes back to the language barrier, where it's like, oh, you know, it's like I'm a gamer, but I'm interested in science. But sometimes it's like, oh, well, what the fuck are half these words? You have to look up all these words and stuff like that, find definitions for stuff. Where it's like, for instance, in a video game, the way you do that is you use whatever it is, and that's how you know what it is. But you can't really. It's all theoretical, so you can't put it into actual practice. Where as in a video game, you actually can. A call to create a new refined language for a certain category instead of creating new subsidiary words that, for instance, they're not relatable, and that creates the language gap that usually people are like, oh, I just, you know, it's too much work. It's basically like learning a new language half the time. But one thing I find, for instance, with video games that's very relatable is the fact that you are engaged with whatever it is that you're using or working with. So it's not theoretical, whereas most other things, unless you're actually, like, if you're just thinking about something, like for me, if I'm like, oh, I like video games, but now I'm trying to look into like UFC fighting and like getting into sports and stuff like that. So it's like, it's a little challenging to jump those gaps. So despite having a complete fucking understanding of the English language and stuff like that, it's still a challenge to try and break a language barrier that's literally your own language. It's just different calls, different meanings for different things. So one of the biggest things is trying to imagine not only that on a scale of learning a new language or a different language, for instance, and trying to find those, I guess you would call them, they would almost be cultural gaps or groups where the clustered language is completely different than somewhere else. So I think finding a unifying basis for the language barrier is like the video game concept of, instead of it being theoretical, it's more in practice, I think. Well, in regards to that, how would you implement that? That's the biggest part, is the idea of their language isn't complete yet, you know? If your language was complete, you essentially would only have one language, because it would be so complete and relatable that well, that's when you go down the road of you'd have to break down all barriers. It's basically an inability to read your mind or body language. Like, read your body language so well that it was almost as if you could read your mind, you know? Wouldn't be a start from scratch, it'd be an accumulation. Like, for instance, that's exactly what we're seeing, where sayings are becoming incorporated into other languages as if they're a part of the language itself, even though they're not. They're just extensions. So, in that regard, every language has to have some sort of fundamental basis, which, as far as we know, the only common between every language is the only commonality we actually know pretty much is vowels. Simple fact of our mouths have a very hard time saying consecutive consonants, like even in that, you have the essences of vowels at the end of each consonant in order to basically roll on to the next sound. So commonalities are a, u, e, o, the 5 vowels, the sounds that carry other sounds. Combine those together to get like e, like ea, like I, like ai. And there's certain consonants that go there, like sh, and although sh could be its own letter, essentially. But that's what English language is all about. Like, for instance, in Japanese, it's a, u, e, o, ka, ki, ku, ke, ko. It's a consonant and a vowel, so they're extra associative sounds that you may not pronounce. Like desu, you wouldn't necessarily pronounce the u at the end. You'd be more like a des or a tsu. Well, we're running out of time here, so unfortunately I'm going to have to close her up. But, yeah, pilot episode of Ittocs Taco Talks. Talks. Signing off. Thank you, Ittocs. We will be back. This is, Scotty, signing off. Peace out.